Well, again, welcome to everyone. Now, today is one of God's appointed times. It's one of His weekly Sabbath days. Now, last week, we were talking about the holy convocation we're commanded to have on the Sabbath day. We said that the most important thing about assembling together on the Sabbath day was to be there. Of course, we also noticed Hebrews 10, verse 25, that reminds us to not forsake the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Well, the way things are going today, I think we can see that day approaching. But I do sometimes get questions about how we are to observe God's Sabbath day in general. Today, let's take a look at how God commands us to observe His Sabbaths, in addition, of course, to gathering together to meet with other brethren. Now, sometimes I know those who are new in the faith might think that keeping the Sabbath is difficult or burdensome. But 1 John 5, verse 3 tells us, "For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not grievous." The International Standard Version says His commandments are not difficult. English Standard Version says His commandments are not burdensome. But for many of us beginning to observe God's Sabbath days, it can take a bit of adjustment to our routines. But it doesn't take us long to discover that God's Sabbaths are indeed a delight, as we'll see later today in Isaiah 58, verse 13. Let me tell you a little story about me when I first began to keep the Sabbath days holy. I was kind of anxious about this. I wanted to try it really hard. Found myself out mowing my yard on a riding lawnmower late one Friday afternoon. So again, I was new at keeping the Sabbath, and I was not about to be caught mowing my yard at the beginning of a Sabbath day. As I circled around the yard, the sun would occasionally shine in my eyes, causing me to raise one hand to shield my eyes from the bright light of the sun. I knew the Sabbath was rapidly approaching. Fearing that I might continue to work into the Sabbath, I suddenly got the idea maybe I should get off the mower and run into the house. Then I could boot up my computer and check it to see what time the sun would set. Then I could look at a clock to see how much time I had left to complete my mowing. But of course, leaving the tractor to go into the house to determine how much time I had left would waste valuable time. So what was I to do? Well, we live at the top of a hill and can see for many miles. The horizon is very flat. And suddenly it hit me. When does the Sabbath begin? At sundown, right? I didn't need a computer and a clock. I just needed to keep my eyes on that lowering sun that was in my eyes. That was all. That was easy. But I was trying to make things difficult. I think God probably got a chuckle out of that. I do believe He has a sense of humor. But sometimes when we're new at it, we don't always know exactly how to keep the Sabbath. We might actually have anxiety about how we should keep it, but we really shouldn't. Let's take a look at this, though. But before we get into how to keep God's Sabbaths, let's quickly review the Sabbath day itself. Let's do that by beginning to turn to Genesis 1, verse 1, the very beginning of the Bible. Genesis 1, verse 1. We should probably take a look at the origin of God's Sabbath, and it began at the beginning. Again, Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, the rest of chapter 1 tells us that God created the heavens and the earth, and God created everything in 6 days. So let's move over, if you would, to the last verse of Genesis chapter 1. That's Genesis 1, verse 31. And God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. Now the next verse, Genesis 2, verse 1. So what was next after the creation? Again, Genesis 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Again, this was at the end of the 6th day. Verse 2. And on the 7th day, God ended His work which He had made, and He rested on the 7th day from all His... Excuse me. Sorry, I'll start over again. And on the 7th day, God ended His work which He had made, and He rested on the 7th day from all His work which He had made. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it He had rested from all his work which God created and made. In verse 3, we see that God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Now, sanctified is a Hebrew word, kadash, and it means to appoint, consecrate, dedicate, to make holy, and set apart from the other 6 days of the week. We also see in verses 2 and 3 that God rested from all his work on the seventh day. So if you would turn to Isaiah chapter 40, that's Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 28. Isaiah 40 and verse 28. So was God just completely worn out from all his creation? Was God tired? Was he weary? Did he need a break? Well, let's see. Again, Isaiah 40 verse 28 tells us, "Have you not known? Have you not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, faints not, neither is he weary?" Faints is the word ya'af in the Hebrew. It means to tire or faint. So God doesn't tire or faint. And weary is yagah in Hebrew, and it means to be exhausted or to be weary. So again, God doesn't get exhausted. He doesn't get tired. But Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 does say God rested. Now, the word rested here is actually Sabbath in the Hebrew. And according to Strong's, it actually means to cease and also to celebrate. God didn't stop at the end of the sixth day because he was tired. He stopped because he had finished his creation of the heavens and the earth. And this small phase of God's plan for us was complete. God looked at his creation and he saw that it was good. Perhaps he celebrated it in a sense because it was good, as Strong seems to suggest. How many of us, when we finished a major project, will stop, take a break, and look back on our project and hopefully say to ourselves, this project is complete and all is good. It's great. Well, on that seventh day, God looked back at his own creation, and it's a very special day to him, also to us. And God made that seventh day of the week unlike the rest. God made the seventh day holy, and he set apart that seventh day from all the other 6 days of the week. And we need to remember that God's Sabbath day was created for man, not just for the Jews or anyone else. It was created for us. As Jesus said in Mark 2, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. It was created for our benefit. It should never be a burden. If it's a burden to us, then we're probably doing something wrong. And I will say to those who are yet to keep God's Sabbaths, you probably don't know what you're missing. It's a time when we rest. And as humans, we certainly can use the rest. And like God's first Sabbath, it's a time for us to reflect on the wonderful things that God has done. Also, it's a time to reflect on what we've accomplished in the previous 6 days. Our daily study of Scripture has hopefully brought us better understanding. But the Sabbath is when we have an entire day to learn and grow closer to God. Each Sabbath day, we have an appointment with God and with our brethren. God made this appointment with us at creation. This appointment has never been changed or canceled. In fact, the Sabbath is a sign between God and his people forever. Turn to Exodus 31, if you would. That's Exodus 31, verse 13. Exodus chapter 31 and verse 13. Here's what God instructed Moses to tell the Israelites. And remember, today we are grafted in Israelites. So again, Exodus 31, verse 13. I'll be reading this in the English Standard Version. Again, Exodus 31:13. I'll get it right. You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, well, that sounds very important. Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. So note that the Sabbath is a sign between God and man. We know that signs communicate things to us. So if we fail to keep God's Sabbaths, we're going to lose some of that communication. We don't want to do that. And also note that the Sabbath is a sign throughout our generations. So it's not been altered or done away with as some today might suggest. Also, Ezekiel 20 verse 12 tells us, reading back in the King James, it says, "Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them." And later in verse 20, same thing, "And hallow my Sabbaths, and they shall be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God." God's Sabbaths are a sign between him and us. They're to be observed throughout our generations, meaning we should continue to observe them. And they're also a sign between God and his people. Let's turn next to Exodus. Exodus 20, verse 8. Exodus 20, verse 8. We'll be looking here at the fourth of the Ten Commandments. Most of you probably caught that, but that'll be again in Exodus 20 and verse 8. It's just the fourth and the longest of the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 tells us, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." Now, God didn't declare the Sabbath day here in Exodus. We saw earlier that God declared the Sabbath at the beginning of creation. Here he was reminding the Israelites to keep the Sabbath. Now, I suspect some had stopped doing so, just as so many have today. But if we're keeping the commandments of God, the fourth and longest of the Ten Commandments certainly deserves our attention, even though most people tend to forget about it. Verse 9, "6 days shall you labor and do all your work." Just as God did, as an example to us, we're to rest or to cease from our work after 6 days of labor. Verse 10, "But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates." Now, I want you to remember this, within your gates. We're coming back to that. But for now, let's go ahead to verse 11. "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them there is, and rested the Sabbath day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So what does verse 10 tell us? Well, it tells us we're not to work on the Sabbath. Not only us, but our children and our servants as well are not to work on the Sabbath. So you might want to place a bookmark here at Exodus 20, verse 10. We'll be coming back to it a little later. By the way, another thing that God asked of us is found in Isaiah 58, verse 13. We'll go there later. But it tells us that we're not to seek our own pleasure on the Sabbath. In other words, our focus should be on God on the Sabbath day. We shouldn't plan activities that distract us from our focus on God. Imagine we planned a big day at a NASCAR racetrack. We might get up early to travel to the track. We'd be focused on racing that day. Our focus would not be on God and spiritual things, and we likely wouldn't have time for a holy convocation that day. No, we're to devote the Sabbath day to spending time with God and each other the entire day. Of course, remember the two greatest commandments. I'll remind you of those in Matthew 22, verse 37. Jesus told us, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And that's what we're really concerned about on God's Sabbath days, both those things. So how does God want us to observe his Sabbath day? Unlike God, we need physical rest. And more today, I think many of us need a mental break from our jobs just as much as a physical break. We're to refrain from work on the Sabbath. We're to rest. We're to assemble together, and we're to keep the focus on God on his Sabbath day. We're not to plan a big day out that isn't focused on God. I think most of us are aware that we're to rest on the Sabbath day and keep it holy or special. but often get questions about just exactly what we should and shouldn't do on the Sabbath. What should we not do on the Sabbath? Well, we shouldn't work. We just talked about that. Now, for example, before I retired, I worked in an office Monday through Friday. I was off on the Sabbath day. But sometimes in my line of work, things have to be done on the weekends. When that became necessary, I scheduled my time to avoid working on the Sabbath. Now, answering my question I put off earlier, has there ever been an emergency, for example, that occurred on the Sabbath day that needed my immediate attention? Well, yes, that did happen. So what happened then? We'll get to that in just a minute. I'll finally get to it, but it's just not our primary form of employment. We should not perform routine maintenance on our vehicles or clean our gutters on the Sabbath day. These things should be done, of course, on the weekly work days, regular work days. These things are work for us and would, to a degree, deprive us of the rest and spiritual nourishment and growth the Sabbath day was intended for. Turn next to Mark 15, verse 42. If you would, that's Mark chapter 15 and verse 42. In order that we can rest on the Sabbath, the day before Sabbath is called the preparation day. We prepare the day before. We do all the work needed to allow us that day of rest and devotion to God with as few distractions as possible. Here in verse 42, we find ourselves on the day before a Sabbath. Notice the preparation day is defined as the day preceding the Sabbath. Again, Mark 15, verse 42. This is right after Jesus' crucifixion. And now when even was come, because it was a preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of God, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Jesus. You might recall they wanted to get Jesus in his tomb before the oncoming Sabbath day, because, of course, for one thing, burial was considered work. Now, any day before a Sabbath day is a preparation day, a day to prepare for the Sabbath, a day to get our chores done in preparation of the coming Sabbath so we won't need to work then, right? What about cooking on the Sabbath day? I sometimes get questions about that. Let's turn to Exodus for that. Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16, verse 23. That's Exodus chapter 16, 23. Here the Israelites had left Egypt, of course, and likely had lost sight of the Sabbath and how to observe it. So here in Exodus, God, by way of Moses, was trying to get them back on track in the observance of the Sabbath. So again, Exodus 16, verse 23. And he said to them, "This is that which the Lord has said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you will bake today, and seethe or boil that you will seethe, and that which remains over, lay up for you to be kept until the morning." So here in verse 23, Moses told the people to cook whatever they're going to cook the day before the Sabbath day. They were to do this, of course, on the preparation day. Whatever was left over, or what was left over, I should say, they were to eat the next day on the Sabbath. Here's an example of preparing a meal maybe, but most of us know what it's like to prepare a typical Thanksgiving dinner. Often those preparing that meal get up early and work a large part of the day to prepare that meal. And that's right, they work a large part of the day if you ever watch somebody do this, and this is definitely work. A lot of that happens on other days as well. So am I saying we shouldn't prepare anything to eat on the Sabbath day? Well, no, not at all. Back in the days of the Exodus, preparing meals was quite a chore. Typically, a fire would even have to be started if you're going to cook. But before that, one might have to go gather some sticks to get the fire started. You might recall that didn't work out very well for the man that gathered the sticks on the Sabbath. We read about it in Numbers chapter 15. If you recall, he was killed because of it. But remember, There were no refrigerators, no ovens, electric ovens, or gas ovens. There were no microwaves in those days. And cooking was really work. So the Israelites kept their leftovers from their preparation day and ate them on the Sabbath. Verse 24. Regarding the food they prepared on the preparation day, and they laid it up till the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. And Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field. So here God was teaching the people not to collect manna or go out and work on the Sabbath day. They were to collect and prepare what they needed to eat for the Sabbath day on the day before, the preparation day. Verse 26. Here again is an example for us. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. So again, he was teaching them that not to work on the Sabbath. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for together, and they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, How long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the sixth day the bread of 2 days. Abide you every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. So he was teaching about this. So here, God was not only reminding the Israelites which day of the week was the Sabbath, but he was also showing them that they were not to work by spending so much time preparing to cook and cooking on the Sabbath day, which was a big deal to them. Now today, our food preparation can be very fast and very easy. A bowl of cereal or a sandwich takes little time and doesn't interfere with our Sabbath day. Reheating food cooked on the preparation day also takes little time and effort on the Sabbath. Now, spending hours in the kitchen, on the other hand, would be a problem. And it's not just cooking in the kitchen. It's the time spent that takes us away from God, our Bibles, and the brethren. Chopping salads and vegetables, even if they're not cooked, can take up an unnecessary amount of time. I believe the idea here is not to have anyone stuck in the kitchen for any appreciable length of time. And we also shouldn't need to make a trip to the supermarket on the Sabbath to purchase food. We should already have it. Purchasing it perhaps on the preparation day if necessary. Now, in fact, buying, selling, or otherwise conducting business is prohibited on the Sabbath. And this would be a form of work. So to look at that, let's go to Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 28. That's Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 28. So buying, selling, conducting business is also something we don't want to do on the Sabbath. Again, that's going to distract us from our Sabbath time. Again, that's Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 28. Here we're going to find that people were turning back to serve God. This is something they had not been doing, but they're going to fix it. Let's see how they do that. Again, Nehemiah 10, verse 28. And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinims, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding. So they're turning to the law of God. They have knowledge and they understand. Reminds us of us a little bit. Verse 29. They clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and into an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God and his judgments and his statutes. If that sounds a little confusing, the International Standard Version says they entered into an oath enforced by a curse to walk in God's law. It's a little different. Verse 30. And that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land. Those are the people outside. These aren't God's people. Nor take their daughters for our sons. Now, notice as we read in verse 31 that people came in to them and brought things into Jerusalem for sale, and they did so on the Sabbath, among other days, I suppose. But we'll see that people refused to purchase any of it on the Sabbath day. They refused to buy or sell. They would not conduct business on the Sabbath day. Verse 31. And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day. Now, ware here means merchandise in general. Victuals are grain or food. I'll read it in the Bible. I'll read verse 31 in the Bible in basic English. It says, and if the peoples of the lands come to do trade in goods or food on the Sabbath day, that we would not trade with them on the Sabbath. Now, having seen that, let's go back to Exodus 20, verse 10. Hope you held your place there. That's Exodus 20, verse 10. So, we're not to buy, sell, or conduct business on the Sabbath day. The people keeping God's Sabbaths here would not purchase general merchandise. They would not purchase food on the Sabbath. So, if the peoples of the lands, presumably not God's people, came to trade or sell goods to God's people, they would refuse to do so on the Sabbath days. Now, try to stay with me here if you can. These people of the lands did not dwell inside the people's gates. They came from outside the gates. So keep it in mind. Again, Exodus 20, verse 10. We read this a minute ago, or a few minutes ago. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. Within your gates. So we know that we are not to do any work on the Sabbath, but who else is included in this prohibition from work? Well, we're not to have our children work. We just saw that. I mean, it's not like, no, God, I didn't want to work on the Sabbath. I just sent my children to work instead. Well, that wouldn't make any sense, even if it wasn't said specifically in the commandment. I think everyone understands that if it's wrong for us, it's wrong for our children as well. What about our servants? What about those that serve us? Well, if we manage others where we work, should we send them out to work on the Sabbath day? Maybe these people aren't our personal servants, but they're following our orders. They still do service to an extent. Well, when I was working, I never scheduled anything for myself or my staff on a Sabbath day before I retired. If necessary, I would schedule the time after the Sabbath. That way, if it took longer than expected, it would not have interfered with the Sabbath day. Now, it's clear that God commands us not to have our servants work on the Sabbath, and to many people, this would include anyone they hire or pay on the Sabbath day. They wouldn't do that. But others see it differently. And this can be an area of confusion. So since we're here, let's talk about one of the things that I know that some of us believe differently about, and that is, specifically, whether dining out on the Sabbath is breaking the Sabbath or not. If God tells us not to have our servants perform work for us, then anyone we pay to work for us on the Sabbath day is in our employ, if only for a temporary amount of time. So would it be wrong to intentionally hire someone and pay them to install a deck on our house on the Sabbath? Is it a violation of God's commandment to have others work for us on the Sabbath, the service? Well, for those that answer yes, when it comes time to dining out during the Sabbath day, wouldn't that be the exact same thing? In both cases, we'd be contracting with someone to serve us in some way, and that would make them our servants. In fact, the person that serves us in a restaurant is called a server. And that might be a problem. In addition, we'd be making a business transaction as well when we paid for our food, something the Israelites wouldn't do when those from the land came in. On the other hand, many do not see this as a problem. Many will look at the within your gates we've been talking about at the very end of Exodus 20, verse 10. The idea here is that within your gates, only applies to those in the household that you're responsible for. Therefore, if you leave your house, leave your property, then we can hire all the servants that we want because it's no longer within our gates. Many believe that this prohibition on servants does not apply if you're not at home and if you're not within your gates. In Nehemiah, those refusing to purchase food did so within the gates of the city. Now, I feel very confident personally that they did not just step outside the gates of the city, make purchases, and then step back in. If that would have been acceptable, I'm positive those merchants would have thought of that and circumvented the law by setting up shop outside the gates and doing business transactions there. But there's certainly no evidence that they did. We may also want to take a look later at Amos 8, verse 5. Take a look at it for yourself. There it appears that the prohibition on conducting business on the Sabbath day is not related to within your gates, but applies to all forms of conducting business. Some churches make it official doctrine that having a meal out on the Sabbath day is just fine, and others do not. They consider hiring someone to serve us on the Sabbath to be wrong wherever we might employ them. They're still our servants. And in most cases, I believe the position of the individual seems to take that of the position of the church they attend. Whatever the church tells them, that's generally what they do. But regardless of who's right, we should always prove all things to ourselves and never just take our leader's word for it. Don't take my word for it. But I'm afraid many never stop to examine this topic, but we should. And we should do what we become convicted of, always. As for my family, we follow the example we just saw in Nehemiah. We always ensure we have enough food in the house before the Sabbath day, often picking up whatever we need on that preparation day. And on the Sabbath day, either the food has been prepared the day before, or we might have something simple like maybe sandwiches and potato chips, something simple and fast. It takes no time at all to do this. Actually, salads and fresh fruit can be prepared ahead of time and require no cooking. But it takes us less time to prepare the meal on the Sabbath day than it does to eat it, that's for sure. We don't spend much time in the preparation. And this way, we have more time to spend in study or in fellowship with the brethren. This helps make for a quiet and restful Sabbath for us and gives us much more time for spiritual things. Excuse me. As always, we need to study our Bible. We need to rightly divide the word of truth. We're to follow Christ the best we can, and we should always do what we believe to be true, not just what anyone else tells us to do. Back around the year 1492, Columbus wasn't the only story coming out of Spain. The Jews were given 4 months to convert to Catholicism or leave the country. It said that soldiers would go out through the countryside looking for Jews that had not converted to Catholicism and hadn't left the country. But how was it that they were able to locate the Jews? How did they know that those living in one house were Jews and the next house were not? Anyone know? I was told it was by their chimneys. You see, the Jews wouldn't kindle a fire on the Sabbath day. In fact, they would not have any kind of fire burning in their homes on any Sabbath day. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 35. Take a look at this. Exodus chapter 35, we'll begin in verse 1. That's Exodus chapter 35. I'm told that all the soldiers had to do was to pass through the area during the winter months on the Sabbath day. If there was no smoke coming out of the chimney, then these were obviously Jews to be thrown out of Spain. Again, Exodus 35, verse 1. Let's take a look at the passage that's likely responsible for this. And Moses gathered all the congregation of the children of Israel together and said to them, These are the words which the Lord has commanded that you should do them. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be to you a holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whoever does work therein shall be put to death. But notice verse 3. You shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day. I believe verse 3 is where the Jews likely got the idea that they could not have a fire to keep warm on the Sabbath. But is that true? Should we never have a fire on the Sabbath? Not in the fireplace? Not in a wood-burning stove? Not a kerosene or a propane heater? What about heating our homes with natural gas? I believe there are a couple of things to consider here. First, notice that God said not to kindle a fire, or not to start a fire, he says. I have a wood-burning stove myself. Although sometimes that starting a fire in my stove can be frustrating and take a very long time to get started. Happens a lot. Not the best way to spend time on the Sabbath day. But in the winter, I do use it for heat. I generally don't kindle a fire on the Sabbath. The fire's already burning on the Sabbath day. Do I occasionally place another log on the fire? Yep, sure do. But I don't spend a lot of time kindling or building a fire on that Sabbath day. It's already going when the Sabbath begins. Excuse me. Sorry. So anyway, I personally believe that Exodus 35 verse 3 was a prohibition on starting a fire to cook or do other work. Remember, cooking took a long time back then. Actually, if you read verse 3 in the contemporary English version, it actually says this. This is the Exodus 35:3 contemporary English version says, "Don't build a cooking fire at home on the Sabbath." You know that cooking using these old ovens was work. So it really didn't surprise me. And I'm thinking they would not need to have kindled a fire for warmth on the Sabbath because it likely was burning already. They probably kept it burning all the time, I would hope. But they would need to kindle a fire even in the summertime if they were about to cook or use the fire for work. My opinion is that there is no issue with running a wood-burning stove or any other type of stove to stay warm in the wintertime. Although I might suggest starting a fire, if necessary, the day before or sooner if needed, because if you're like me, it takes forever sometimes. Also, you would have the wood available and ready. You wouldn't be going out and gathering it on the Sabbath day, because these kind of things would lead to a disruption to our Sabbath. But I don't particularly agree with the Jews prohibiting fire at all completely on the Sabbath day. To me, our Bibles tell us we are to provide for our families, or else we're worse than non-believers. We can read that in 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. Not providing warmth to our families in the wintertime would seem to be a much greater issue than that of having a fire to keep them warm. The Jews in Jerusalem today also would like to avoid pushing buttons on an elevator on the Sabbath. I used to think that was because they considered pushing the button to be work. However, I've been told that the actual reason for this is because that when a switch contact closes, there is a tiny spark that occurs, and that's true. I'm told that the Jews consider that tiny spark as kindling a fire on the Sabbath. But I don't believe this is what God was talking about when he said not to kindle a fire on the Sabbath. You know, we could extend that concept to our automobiles. In gasoline-powered cars, there is a spark that ignites the gasoline in the engine cylinders, producing a much larger fire in our engines. So we're certainly kindling a fire there. And this fire, of course, creates heat, and that creates pressure within the cylinders that eventually drives the wheels of our vehicle. Electric vehicles can also have tiny sparks as well. But I don't believe this is what God intended by not kindling a fire on the Sabbath. I think we get carried away with this sometimes. I personally believe the issue with starting a fire, which was work itself in those days, in order to do some time-consuming cooking or possibly even some metal work, would be prohibited. So if you don't plan on performing extensive baking or boiling with your kindled fire, if you don't plan to use a fire in your home to work with metals or perform some other kind of work, I don't personally see an issue with having a fire to keep warm. I don't think that was the intent of the commandment. Now, are there any exceptions to these rules or commandments we've been talking about today? Are there any? Let's talk about some exceptions. Let's go to Matthew chapter 12. We'll begin at verse 1. That's easy. Matthew chapter 12. Are there exceptions to any of these commands for the Sabbath day? We'll begin with the Pharisees complaining to Jesus that his disciples were sinning for plucking ears of corn to eat. Again, that's Matthew chapter 12, and we'll begin right there in verse 1. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. Now, actually, I might mention the Bible says they were plucking grain. Corn was not specifically mentioned in the original text. That's just the King James translation. Anyway, verse 2. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, Christ, "Behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." But he, Jesus, said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests?" Well, David and his soldiers were fleeing from Saul. And they kind of had a crisis, maybe an emergency, you might say. They were very hungry. So the priest provided for their immediate need. Remember, we're to love God, we're also to love our brethren. And what about me? I was mentioning this earlier and never got to it, but I typically work at least 3 hours on the Sabbath every week, sometimes more. I'll bring our equipment online here, perform preliminary sound checks, adjust sound levels, check the network connection, ensure that our batteries are charged and all backup devices are loaded and on standby. I check our video status. Jackie reviews our music, warms up our flute, while I make final adjustments to the audio levels. And none of this can really be done beforehand. Speaking itself can be work. Ask someone that does a lot of that. And after the service, I shut everything down. So make no mistake, I do perform work on the Sabbath day. But I'm counting on our next verse, verse 5, to excuse me from the work that I do on the Sabbath day that would seem to violate God's law. Verse 5, Matthew 12, verse 5. "For have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" Well, I'm not a Levitical priest, but I believe that God sees those working in his service on the Sabbath day and will hold them blameless as well. At least I'm counting on that. Verse 6. "But I say to you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day." Verse 9. When he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days?" That they might accuse him. So they're trying to catch him up here. Verse 11, "And he said to them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep? If it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days." There can be exceptions. We can do some work in certain situations. Now, speaking about me, I talked about it earlier. In the last 13 years of my employment, I had 3 days where I had an emergency at work. Now, each time I had to drive in on the Sabbath day to solve the problem. I don't think I was gone over 2 hours on any of those Sabbaths. But as it turns out, children's welfare was depending on me to get those issues fixed. So we can and should plan to keep Sabbath interruptions to an absolute minimum. But sometimes, even though we do the best we can, sometimes things go wrong, and we need to do good on the Sabbath. When something unexpected or unpreventable comes up on the Sabbath, we often need to react to it. Luke 14, if you would. Luke 14, verse 1. Luke chapter 14, verse 1. "We should do everything we can to prevent being interrupted on our Sabbath day. But should the unexpected happen, we sometimes need to work to address the situation." Again, Luke 14, verse 1. Hang on a second here. Let's skip over to, if you would, Luke 14, verse 4. Down. And they held their peace, and he took them and healed them. He was healing people, and let him go. And answered them, saying, which of you shall have a donkey or an ox fall into a pit, and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him again these things. What I was going to say is, this is what we often hear of as the ox in the ditch. Yes, the Sabbath day is a day of rest. But when it becomes necessary to assist others and show love to others, and even our animals, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath day. Particularly farmers often have animals that need some attention on every day of the week, including the Sabbath. Sometimes cows need to be milked. Dogs and cats might need to be fed and watered. Baby chicks might need to be checked on every day. Proverbs 12, verse 10 tells us in the English Standard Version, whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast. So we have to take care of our animals too. But again, anything we can do before the Sabbath, we should do. But sometimes there are things we must do on the Sabbath that we simply can't avoid. Go next to Isaiah. Isaiah 56 in verse 1. That's Isaiah chapter 56 in verse 1. Isaiah 56. God promises to bless those who keep his Sabbath. Let's read about that. Isaiah 56 verse 1. I'll be reading here in the contemporary English version of the Bible. It says, the Lord said, be honest and fair. Soon I will come to save you. My saving power will be seen everywhere on earth. I will bless everyone who respects the Sabbath and refuses to do wrong. Foreigners who worship me must not say, the Lord won't let us be part of his people. Men who are unable to become fathers must no longer say, we are dried up trees. To them, I, the Lord, say, respect the Sabbath. Obey me completely and keep our agreement. Then I will set up monuments in my temple with your names written on them. This will be much better than having children, because these monuments will stand there forever. Foreigners will follow me. They will love me and worship in my name. They will respect the Sabbath and keep our agreement. Good. That sounds good. Very good. To conclude today, God blessed and hallowed the seventh day of the week. The Sabbath day was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath day is a blessing to us, if we'll allow it to be so, if we observe it as God intended, as God has commanded us to do. How are we to observe God's Sabbath day? Well, God tells us not to work on the Sabbath, but rather rest from our labors. He tells us not to do our own pleasure, but rather we're to spend that time with him and each other, the brethren. This is a day for a sacred assembly. Today we talked about some specific questions people have as they looked at the Sabbath day, and often get questions about what is considered work on the Sabbath day. In other words, what we should and should not do. Let's see if I can sum all this up very quickly. So my answer to all these questions, I think, goes like this. Basically, we're to prepare ahead of time for the Sabbath day. We should do our very best to have all our chores and regular work finished by the end of the preparation day. The Sabbath day should be free from work and distractions as much as possible so that we can make our appointment with God and each other. But always remember, the two greatest commandments are to love God and each other. If we need to serve God or help out in an emergency situation, I believe we can and should make that occasional exception. I think we just need to ask ourselves one simple question. That's all we have to do. And this is the question. Have we planned to have a distractions-free Sabbath where we can spend time alone with God and the brethren? If so, I'd say we're keeping the Sabbath correctly. I'd like to close today with Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. That's Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. The Sabbath day is a gift from God. Let's receive this gift with great thanksgiving. And let's allow the Sabbath to bless us as it was intended. by keeping it as God has directed. After all, Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Isaiah 58, verse 13. I'll be reading this in the International Standard Version. Here's what we read. It says, "If you keep your feet from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own interest on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own ways and seeking your own pleasure or speaking merely idle words, then you will take delight in the Lord. He will make you ride upon the heights of the earth. He will make your feast on the inheritance of your ancestor Jacob, your father. Yes, the mouth of the Lord has spoken."